The title of my talk is Reconciling with Our Enemies. So, in Islam, there are many names of God. They represent the attributes of Allah, the ones that people should strive to emulate. Two of the most notable are Al-Afwa, which means to forgive, and Al-Saf, which means to forgive and to forget. Forgiveness and reconciliation, we sometimes conflate them, but they're two very different actions, two very different ways to react to wrongs that have been done to us. I want to talk about that today. What is forgiveness and what is reconciliation? How does a person get to one or the other place? And how does the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, and the Buddhist tradition think and talk about the concept of forgiving and its next step, which is reconciliation? I thought that using these three major faiths, which are actually currently at war with each other, depending on the part of the world that you live in, might be an interesting way to engage with this topic. The holy books of these three faiths are the cornerstone of faith for billions of people worldwide, but the faiths often can't reconcile themselves. So, what do they have to say about the concept in their own words? Also, I've just been thinking a lot lately about forgiveness. More and more people find themselves on the opposite sides of theological or ideological divides. And I've seen a lot of social media content around the idea of forgiving a person who doesn't deserve it, or forgiving people by walking away from a person who doesn't give you back the energy that you give to them. Both of these use the word forgiveness, but they feel more like just shutting yourself off from the work of forgiveness or reconciliation by walking away, or thinking of yourself as somehow better than the person that you are forgiving. I mean, obviously, not every person needs to coexist peacefully with every other person. But after I read about how these three faiths talk about and advise the faithful on how to handle forgiveness, I do think there's a lot to be learned about how to approach the people that we may need to forgive for our own peace of mind and our own well-being. I'm a historian, so I like to go chronologically with everything. The oldest faith of the three is obviously Judaism. A lot of the Torah was created during a time of extremely different morals, but also different narratives. This was before the Code of Hammurabi, some of these oldest stories. So the stories are the oldest that we have in many cases, but because the stories were told so long ago, the reasons why things happen is not clearly spelled out, and it doesn't seem to matter much in the narratives. Narrative has evolved a lot in the past 3,500 years, the way that we write and try to explain ourselves through writing. The Torah can be hard to read for that reason. The Old Testament, the Torah. For instance, the story of Jacob and Esau has always been really confusing for me. Jacob, whose name means tricky, by the way, tricks their father in order to steal his brother Esau's blessing. He then goes through many adventures for about 14 years. And when he returns, he gets God's forgiveness, but he also gets his brother's forgiveness. But there's very little in the way of explanation about Esau's forgiveness. So the question I always have to ask is, nothing that happened was fair to his brother, but he still forgives Jacob. But the story is silent about why that happens. Rabbi Harold Schulweis wrestled with this. Rabbi Schulweis spent his career in California, and he was famous, sometimes infamous, for his insistence on inclusion. He introduced bat mitzvahs to his congregations at a time when people were not allowing girls to do that. He held a lot of interfaith programs. He also openly included the LGBTQ community throughout his career, which spanned from the 1940s to the early 2000s. He also helped to found the Chavura movement, which created lay fellowships of the faithful and didn't rely on clergy to learn more about the Jewish faith. So during the Jewish high holy days, the days of awe, Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, the day when everyone asks forgiveness and they make amends, or they should make amends. Rabbi Schulweis asked his congregation, quote, "Is there a divide between what we can forgive and what God can forgive?" He asks us if we're just God's cheerleaders. We just watch him understand other people. pardon other people, forgive other people, while we get to sit in the pews and say, all acts are God's to take, not mine. Judaism doesn't work like that, he says. A cornerstone of the Jewish belief is that God is not responsible for things that we could be doing ourselves. Giving it up to God, which is a sort of popular Christian slogan these days, is actually not considered righteousness in the Jewish faith. It's abdicating responsibility. This is an enormous theological difference between Judaism and Christianity. But it also puts everyone of the Jewish faith in a very interesting position when it comes to forgiveness. Like Islam, which separates the names of forgiveness and reconciliation, there's an acknowledgement in Judaism that forgiveness is not forgetting. One does not flow from the other one naturally. Esau might have forgiven Jacob, but did he forget everything that Jacob did? A very old rabbinic story goes that bad acts are like pounding a nail into a wooden board. Forgiveness is like removing the nail. Once the nail is gone, the hole remains. Forgiveness does not remove the past, but it does signify a new reality. So reconciliation is not God's to create, because God doesn't do things for man. It is each person's responsibility. When they reconcile, they not only remove the nail from the wood, they make the space to create something new. So why did Esau reconcile with Jacob? Who was right and who was wrong? Rabbi Schulweis argues that it doesn't matter who was right. The important thing is always the reconciliation, not to obsess over the past, look forward to the new opportunities that wait for us when we forgive, looking for what might fill the space that the nail left in the wood. And no one, not even God, can do that work except us. We have to change our own hearts all by ourselves, and that's the challenge of the Jewish faith. Buddhism, which is the next oldest faith, it was started in about 6th century BC. It doesn't worship the Buddha, but it is still a faith system. Buddha is often called the perfect one, and he told his followers there's an addiction to sense pleasures, which is low and coarse, and there's an addiction to self-mortification, or asceticism, which is painful and unworthy. The middle path is the only way to enlightenment. Buddhism reflects often on what suffering is and what it means. So holding a grudge or refusing to forgive someone is actually a form of suffering because it's holding on to a state. And holding on to any state without recognizing that the state won't last forever is what causes suffering. Nothing is eternal in Buddhism. Thupten Chodron is the abbess of the only Tibetan Buddhist training monastery in the United States. And she has talked widely on the concept of forgiveness and reconciliation. In one of her sermons, actually to an interfaith group of both Catholics and Buddhists, she starts by reminding people that they might believe that they're nonviolent. They might believe other people are the problem, or that anger is justified in any case because our anger is going to correct society or correct someone else's behavior. But she says none of that is precisely true. Like I said earlier, the social media posts that hold yourself up as the person who was wronged, and so I might walk away in order to be happy. We are setting ourselves up as the right person. We say our own suffering is actually coming from someone else. Buddhism recognizes that the only person that we can change is actually just ourselves. And since we're still interdependent on other people, perhaps more than ever before in human history, we have to recognize that our happiness is also interdependent. And this is where compassion becomes very important. The Dhammapada is a collection of Buddha's sayings and insights. It was compiled in the few hundred years after his death. He says when we hold fast to thoughts like, they harmed me, they mistreated me, they robbed me, we keep hatred alive. If we thoroughly release ourselves from thoughts like they harmed me, hatred is vanquished. Never by hatred is hatred conquered, only by the readiness to love. It seems like everybody probably has an example that they could bring up, the bad things that other people have done to us. We hold tightly, right, to those bad things. Sometimes we even create an identity around past bad things. We hold on to the feelings we have for decades. But who really suffers when we hold on to those feelings? Shodron says, who is it really that is suffering when we hold on? Is it the person that we're refusing to forgive? No, of course not. Buddhism tells us the only person who suffers is ourselves. So we forgive ourselves to make ourselves happy, to release our own misery. As Buddha said, hatred is not conquered by hatred. Shodron says, the people who have harmed us did what they did because they were trying to be happy themselves, but they were confused about what the causes of happiness are. So it makes more sense to look at the person who harmed us and wish them happiness. Real compassion thinks, wouldn't it be wonderful if that person had peace? And wishing them well. Reconciliation, which is the next step in the process of forgiveness, would be not just to wish them well, but maybe even try to help that other person be less confused about what the true causes of happiness are. That would take a lot of courage and a lot of strength. But for Buddhists, it would also be a release from suffering. Islam, which is the youngest of the faiths, did not come about until after the death of Jesus Christ by a few hundred years. It's often held up actually by both Christians and Muslims as being very different from Christianity, but it shares a lot with Christianity when it comes to the concept of forgiveness. In some ways, far, far more than Christianity shares with Judaism. God is held up as the perfect model for behavior in Islam. As Allah forgives, so should we. His 99 names, which include the ones that I began with, Al-Afwa and Al-Saf, are the 99 ways in which anyone can try to emulate Allah himself. So it's important to remember too that everything in Islam is derived from Muhammad's words, the Prophet. The word of Allah was given to Muhammad and he had scribes write them down. It's interesting, Muhammad actually couldn't read or write. And this is similar too to Christianity, where others wrote the actions and life of Jesus, who is held up as our perfect model of goodness. It's also surprisingly pretty similar to how Buddhism operates, which I do find very interesting. The idea that there is a model somewhere for you to emulate and that perfecting yourself is possible. These are very different than Judaism, which shares the stories of flawed humans and asks the faithful to use them as the lesson to improve. Anyway, the Quran states that all faithful should be as forgiving as Allah, because wouldn't you want to be forgiven if you were at fault? And how can a person expect Allah to forgive their sins if they can't find it within themselves to forgive others? Suppressing the nafs, which is the word for ego, is paramount to these kinds of actions in Islam. I'll come back to nafs in a second. Hadith are where a lot of the guidance for Muslims comes from outside of the Quran. The Hadith are thousands of sayings which were attributed to Muhammad, and they were compiled in the Middle Ages around the 8th century into 6 books. These sayings, as much as the Quran, form the basis of right behavior for people of faith. One Hadith states that the Prophet said he could promise a house in paradise to the man who could avoid quarreling even when he's right, which makes it pretty clear that maybe it's not that easy to get a house in paradise. Another Hadith purports that the Prophet said no true Muslim was allowed to avoid someone they were fighting with for more than 3 days. And the person who gave greetings and reconciled first would be the better Muslim. And even after death, the Hadith tells the faithful that there are still tests. On the bridge over hell, before the entrance to paradise, all believers have to confront each other about the wrongs they did to each other in their lifetimes, and they have to forgive each other before they can enter. Giving up the nafs, giving up ego, is kind of the common denominator in these hadith. A person can only forgive other people or lead a good life if they're willing to give up on being right. In this way, the faithful can emulate Allah, who forgives everyone if they just ask for it. And reconciliation, which is the next step, is even more important in the process. In the Hadith that states a true Muslim would be the first to offer peace during a fight, there's a direct line between the person who can manage reconciliation and the strength of their faith. Like Christianity, Islam leans on these twin concepts. It's unconditional love, but there's also judgment. You're loved, but you're being weighed. Your chances to be good, to show God your ability to be good, are limitless in the course of your life, but you have to take advantage of those chances. Most of the stories about Muhammad actually focus on the idea of self-reformation, never giving up on the hope that everyone can make peace with each other, just like Allah would be able to do. Like Buddhism, you are offered the opportunity to do the right thing, and you can make yourself happy and fulfilled, whether it's in this life or in the next life if you are from the Islamic faith. When I was researching these faiths, I came across a work called the Nostra Attack, which is a document written by the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II is what it's called, which was a gathering of Catholic thought leaders that drove this big paradigm shift in the way that Catholics approached other faiths and the scientific community. Its effects are actually still rippling through the community 50 years later. When I applied for a job at the University of St. Thomas, our Catholic university here in Houston, one of my application materials was supposed to be an essay on Pope John Paul II's Faith and Reason, which was created in 1998 and was a direct descendant of Vatican II, which was an interesting exercise to have to do, but the Catholic communities are still very entrenched in what Vatican II came up with. The Nostra Attack, which means in our time in Latin, offers a Catholic perspective on other religions. And one passage that I really found remarkable said, "Religions found everywhere try to counter the restlessness of the human heart, each in its own manner, by proposing its ways, its teachings, rules of life, and sacred rites. The Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence the ways of conduct and life that reflect a ray of the truth that enlightens everyone." Reconciliation starts with each of us, but the need for reconciliation across larger groups, nations, religions is probably one of the most pressing needs in the world right now. For these three faiths, the basic tenets are the same. Look at yourself first. Are you in a place to forgive other people? Why not? What holds you back from forgiving? Is it obsessing over the nail that someone else drove into your heart? Is it that you can't imagine yourself feeling any other way? Is it just your ego? This can be applied to any group or any situation, of course. We have evangelicals versus the liberals. We have Myanmar versus the Rohingya. We have Israel versus Palestine. Psychologists say that the hardest part of getting people to reconcile is actually convincing them that they belong to the same community. In many ways, that looks like forgiveness from the community and for yourself. History is littered with the effects of people ignoring each other's common ground. Forgiveness and reconciliation are at their core about forgiving and acknowledging our own shortcomings, as well as other people's shortcomings, which is probably why it's so difficult. Unitarian Universalism embraces those commonalities. I think that's one of our greatest strengths, especially in times like these. When there's so much division and misinformation, I think the ability to forgive may become more necessary than ever.